News outlets spout a lot of mumbo jumbo when it comes to race and policing, but the 18.5 statistic is the most mumbo jumbo of it all.
An officer of the law is
18.5 times
more likely to be killed by a black male
than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer.
18.5 times more likely. That's a fact.
The 18.5 statistic was created by Heather McDonald in 2017 and went viral in her 2020 Wall Street Journal op-ed titled "The Myth of Systemic Police Racism." It gets used all the time, like last month in a Ben Shapiro Daily Wire video.
Police officers are 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by the police.
What they didn't tell you is that when you substitute white people for black people, the number goes from 18.5 to 112. The statistical sleight of hand here is that they take out the bad guys with the guns in the second part of the stat. But you really have to break this stat down to understand why it's so bogus. Taking race out of the equation, the stat merely points out that a group of people, including bad guys with guns, is more dangerous, whether that's 18.5 times or 112 times more dangerous to police officers than police officers are to that same group of people, minus the bad guys with guns. The stat doesn't tell you anything you don't already know. You could substitute police officer for professional paddleballers or marine biologists. No matter what the profession is, that profession is more likely to be killed by a group of people that includes bad guys with guns than that profession is to kill someone in that same group of people minus the bad guys with guns. Let me simplify it even more. Ted Bundy and Ted Logan of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure killing Brenda the marine biologist is more likely than Brenda the marine biologist killing just Ted Logan. Like, of course, when you remove the insane murderer, the statistic comes out the way that it does. And that highlights why that statistic, despite being used all the time by conservative pundits, is utter bullshit. Tommy Lahren mentioned the stat on The Daily Show, and Trevor Noah had no idea how to respond. He just changed the subject.
Here's the thing. Let's move on to like the mainstream media.
But what the stat appears to do is to minimize the wrongful deaths of innocent, unarmed black civilians because of the violence caused by other armed and dangerous black civilians.
The real problem is black crime. I hate to say it, but that is the real problem.
And that makes you a racist, an avowed racist.
how much of the crime is made up by black American offenders.
Adjusted for the homicide rate, whites are 1.7 times more likely than blacks to die at the hands of police. Committed
about 60% of robbery and murder defendants are black, even though 15% of the population in those counties.
Just like the 18.5 statistic, bringing up violent crime rates brings up the bad guys with the guns when the discussion has nothing to do with the bad guys with the guns. Of the people who are killed by the police, most concern is around the people who are not the bad guys with the guns. As a matter of fact, black victims of police violence are more likely to be the good guys who don't have guns than their white counterparts. So bringing up the bad guys with the guns is irrelevant. There's a slightly more nerdy reason why bringing up violent crime rates is irrelevant here, and that's that violent crime is actually not at all correlated with police killings of civilians. Here again, conservative media personalities fall into the category of smashing two numbers together and calling it a statistic. Here they're smashing violent crime rates with police killings, but you can't do that if there's not a real connection. For example, if you plot the two on a chart, you can see how violent crime is actually a terrible predictor of police shootings. So violent crime rates are a distraction because they're logically irrelevant, and they're also a bad distraction because we have the data and we know that there's not a connection there. Which leads me to the last category of misinformation that you get from conservative pundits, and that is debunked or incredibly flawed studies.
A study published this August
2019,
in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences
published research showing that there was, quote, no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police.
It is the rate of violent crime that determines police shootings, the study found.
Harvard professor Roland Fryer.
A national analysis
Finding no evidence of racial bias in shootings by police.
In fact, black civilians are shot less compared to whites.
Actually, police are less likely to kill black people than white people in the same circumstances.
When a study comes out and claims to show that there isn't racism, people are a bit surprised because of all the science that goes against that conclusion. But conservative pundits latch onto it like it's the next Pavlov's dogs. There was this Michigan State study that came out a couple years ago, and one of its claims was that violent crime rates by race has a lot to do with the race of the civilian killed by a police officer. Which is kind of crazy because I just showed you all the evidence that shows that violent crime is not connected with police killings of civilians. The study blew up. Conservative media personalities latched onto it because it claimed to conclude the thing that they'd been saying since forever. But the study was really flawed. The study was retracted by the authors, and among so many issues, it failed to control for population demographics. Imagine if I told you that in Detroit, Michigan, most of the people who are safe drivers are black, while most of the people who get in car accidents are also black. Whereas in San Diego, a small percentage of the safe drivers are black, and a small percentage of the car wrecks involve black people. If I were to tell you that based on that information, black civilians should drive more dangerously so they can avoid getting in car accidents, you'd tell me that I was an idiot. The issue is that I forgot to control for population demographics. The reason that there are more black safe drivers and black people who get in car accidents in Detroit than in San Diego is because a majority of people in Detroit are black, whereas a small percentage of people in San Diego are black. And that's exactly the error that that study made. And if you're like, come on, man, there's no way that a study that was published in a peer-reviewed journal and authored by professors from a large American university made such a silly error. And yeah, that's actually exactly what happened. There's another study that conservatives love. It's a Harvard study that showed that police are more likely to shoot and kill white people than they are black people. People were skeptical of this study, not just because of the conclusion, but because the question that this study sought to answer is actually impossible to answer. The thing you need to know about the Roland Fryer study is that all of its estimates of racial discrimination against black civilians are underestimates. And the reason for that is this thing called collider bias. 538 published this article about collider bias and demonstrates why Fryer's estimates here are all underestimates. Estimating exact individualized racial discrimination figures for police officers involved in fatal shootings of civilians is at this point impossible. Most, if not all, of race and policing misinformation that comes from conservative media personalities can be covered by one of the fallacies that we discussed today. If you found this informative, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. The misinformation that we covered today is a large reason why we had a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who said that the police were killing fewer black folks than they ought to. It's also why the former U.S. Attorney General said this.
The studies I've seen have suggested police are less likely to shoot at a black suspect.
And debunking this misinformation is important because if there's no agreement on what the problem is, then any discussion of a solution is dead on arrival.